Good morning, American literature. So today I'm going to read to you the first 3 pages of the website for The Devil and Tom Walker. Okay? The first 3 pages. Keep in mind, I will be talking throughout this because you do have 23 multiple choice questions that you have to answer. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read and then I'll pause and I'll tell you a little bit about what's going on in the text and the interpretation, okay? So let's go ahead and get started. One day that Tom Walker, oh, that is not it. That is actually on the 3rd page. My bad, guys. All right. A few miles from Boston in Massachusetts, there's a deep inlet winding several miles into the interior of the country from Charles Bay and terminating in a thickly wooded swamp or morass. On one side of this inlet is a beautiful dark grove. On the opposite side, the land rises abruptly from the water's edge into a high ridge, on which grow a few scattered oaks of great age and immense size. Under one of those gigantic trees, according to old stories, there was a great amount of treasure buried by Kidd the pirate. The inlet allowed a facility to bring the money in a boat secretly and at night to the very foot of the hill. The elevation of the place permitted a good lookout to be kept, that no one was at hand, while the remarkable trees formed good landmarks by which the place might easily be found again. The old stories add, moreover, that the devil presided at the hiding of the money and took it under his guardianship. But this, it is well known, he always does with buried treasure, particularly when it has been ill-gotten. Be that as it may, Kidd never returned to recover his wealth, being shortly after seized at Boston, sent out to England, and there hanged for a pirate. I'm going to have to read from my book. I want to talk about that. That's the exposition of the story. The exposition is the beginning of the story that gives you information, okay? And it is surrounding Kidd the Pirate. Kidd the Pirate is an interesting fellow. If you don't know, pirates steal money. And what he did was he actually buried the money, and the devil watches over it. He never came back and got the money because he was hung for being a pirate. That was his punishment for stealing. But the devil watches over any money that is gotten through bad means. So keep that in mind. That's your exposition, okay? About the year 1727, just at the time that earthquakes were prevalent in New England and shook many tall sinners down upon their knees, there lived near this place a meager, miserly fellow of the name of Tom Walker. He had a wife as miserly as himself. They were so miserly that they even conspired to cheat each other. Whatever the woman could lay hands on, she hid away. A hen could not cackle, but she was on the alert to secure the new laid egg. Her husband was continually prying about to detect her secret hoards, and many and fierce were the conflicts that took place about what ought to have been common property. One of the questions on your exit ticket, you have some direct characterization here. What kind of person is Tom Walker? He is meager and miserly. Meager meaning small, miserly meaning stingy. Okay? His wife is also stingy, and they hide things from each other. All right? They lived in a forlorn-looking house that stood alone and had an air of starvation. A few straggling savin trees, emblems of sterility, grew near it. No smoke ever curled from its chimney. No traveler stopped at its door. A miserable horse, whose ribs were as articulate as the bars of a gridiron, stalked about a field, where a thin carpet of moss, scarcely covering the ragged beds of pudding stone, tantalized and balked his hunger, and sometimes he would lean his head over the fence, look piteously at the passer-by, and seem to petition deliverance from this land of famine. The house itself is very not well kept because they're so stingy. They don't spend the money to fix it up, and they don't feed the horse. They keep the horse hungry. He's fed enough to keep him alive, but not enough to keep him sustained, if that makes sense. The house and its inmates had altogether a bad name. Tom's wife was a tall termagant, fierce of temper, loud of tongue, and strong of arm. Her voice was often heard in wordy warfare with her husband, and his face sometimes showed signs that their conflicts were not confined to words. No one ventured, however, to interfere between them. The lonely wayfarer shrunk within himself at the horrid clamor and clapper clawing, eyed the din of discord askance, and hurried on his way, rejoicing if a bachelor in his celibacy. The wife termagant. That means that they fought a lot, he and the wife. And what it says, according to the text, is, and this is a little bit of humor, that they argued a lot, but Tom's face actually showed that their arguments were not confined to words, meaning she used to beat him up. Okay? I also want you to notice a little bit of Washington Irving's style. Wordy warfare, clamor and clapper clawing, tall termagant. You have all of these repeated consonants. He loves alliteration, so he's writing his prose like poetry. I also want you to look that the next paragraph begins with two words, one day. That's a shift in the narrative. Okay, your exposition is over. That's all your background information. Now the story is going to begin. One day that Tom Walker had been to a distant part of the neighborhood, he took what he considered a shortcut homeward through the swamp. Like most shortcuts, it was an ill-chosen route. The swamp was thickly grown with great gloomy pines and hemlocks, some of them 90 feet high, which made it dark at noonday and a retreat for all the owls of the neighborhood. It was full of pits and quagmires, partly covered with weeds and mosses, where the green surface often betrayed the traveler into a gulf of black, smothering mud. There were also dark and stagnant pools, the abodes of the tadpole, the bullfrog, and the water snake, where the trunks of pines and hemlocks lay half drowned, half rotting, looking like alligators sleeping in the mire. Tom had been long picking his way cautiously through the treacherous forest, stepping from tuft to tuft of rushes and roots, which afforded precarious footholds among deep sloughs, or pacing carefully like a cat along the prostrate trunks of trees, startled now and then by the sudden screaming of the bittern or the quacking of a wild duck, rising on the wing from some solitary pool. At length he arrived at a piece of firm ground, which ran out like a peninsula into the deep bosom of the swamp. It had been one of the strongholds of the Indians during their wars with the first colonists. Here they had thrown up a kind of fort, which they had looked upon as almost impregnable, and had used as a place of refuge for their squaws and children. Nothing remained of the old Indian fort but a few embankments, gradually sinking to the level of the surrounding earth and already overgrown in part by oaks and other forest trees, the foliage of which formed a contrast to the dark pines and hemlocks of the swamp. It was late in the dusk of evening when Tom Walker reached the old fort, and he paused there a while to rest himself. Anyone but he would have felt unwilling to linger in this lonely, melancholy place, for the common people had a bad opinion of it, from the stories handed down from the time of the Indian Wars, when it was asserted that the savages held incantations here and made sacrifices to the evil spirit. Tom Walker, however, was not a man to be troubled with any fears of the kind. He reposed himself for some time on the trunk of a fallen hemlock, listening to the boding cry of the tree toad and delving with his walking staff into a mound of black mold at his feet. As he turned up the soil unconsciously, his staff struck against something hard. He raked it out of the vegetable mold, and lo, a cloven skull with an Indian tomahawk buried deep in it lay before him. The rust on the weapon showed that time that had elapsed since the death blow had been given. It was a dreary memento of the fierce struggle that had taken place in this last foothold of the Indian warriors. So I want to talk a little bit about archetypes. Archetypes are patterns in literature. One of the patterns in literature is that the forest is a bad place. Bad things happen in the woods. So right here in this swamp, you have something bad about to happen because, according to most literature, bad things happen in the forest or in the woods or, in this case, the swamp. Okay, so that's an archetype in literature. Another thing I want to talk about here is Washington Irving's style. We talked about alliteration a little bit, and you see that in these passages I just read, tuft to tuft, rushes and roots. So a lot of these repeated consonants. Also, if you look, there's a lot of description here. So he uses a lot of description to paint that imagery. So if you have alliteration, you have imagery and thick, lush description. And the reason why he needs so much description is because in 1824, when people read for entertainment, they needed the picture in their mind. Versus now, if you were to watch a horror movie, all you would see is the dark forest. The camera would just pan across, and you'd already know something bad is going to happen. Okay? So Tom has found a skull in the ground. Humph, said Tom Walker as he gave it a kick to shake the dirt from it. Let that skull alone, said a gruff voice. Tom lifted up his eyes and beheld a great black man seated directly opposite him on the stump of a tree. He was exceedingly surprised, having neither heard nor seen anyone approach, and he was still more perplexed on observing, as well as the gathering gloom would permit, that the stranger was neither Negro nor Indian. It is true he was dressed in a rude half Indian garb, and had a red belt or sash swathed around his body, but his face was neither black nor copper color, but swarthy and dingy and begrimed with soot, as if he had been accustomed to toil among fires and forges. He had a shock of coarse black hair that stood out from his head in all directions, and bore an axe on his shoulder. He scowled for a moment at Tom with a pair of great red eyes. What are you doing on my grounds? Said the black man with a hoarse, growling voice. Your grounds, said Tom with a sneer. No more your grounds than mine. They belong to Deacon Peabody. Deacon Peabody be damned, said the stranger, as I flatter myself he will be if he does not look more to his own sins and less to those of his neighbors. Look yonder, and see how Deacon Peabody is faring. Tom looked in the direction that the stranger pointed, and beheld one of the great trees, fair and flourishing without, but rotten at the core, and saw that it had been nearly hewn through, so that the first high wind was likely to blow it down. On the bark of the tree was scored the name of Deacon Peabody, an eminent man who had waxed wealthy by driving shrewd bargains with the Indians. He now looked round and found most of the tall trees marked with the name of some great man of the colony, and all more or less scored by the axe. The one on which he had been seated, and which had evidently just been hewn down, bore the name of Crowninshield, and he recollected a mighty rich man of that name who made a vulgar display of wealth, which it was whispered he had acquired by buccaneering. He's just ready for burning, said the black man with a growl of triumph. You see, I am likely to have a good stock of firewood for winter. But what right have you, said Tom, to cut down Deacon Peabody's timber? The right of a prior claim, said the other. This woodland belonged to me long before one of your white-faced race put foot upon the soil. And pray, who are you, if I may be so bold? Said Tom. Oh, I go by various names. I am the wild huntsman in some countries, the black miner in others. In this neighborhood, I am known by the name of the black woodsman. I am he to whom the red men consecrated this spot, and in honor of whom they now and then roasted a white man by way of sweet-smelling sacrifice. Since the red men have been exterminated by you white savages, I amuse myself by presiding at the persecutions of Quakers and Anabaptists. I am the great patron and prompter of slave dealers, and the grand master of the Salem witches. The upshot of all which is that, if I mistake not, said Tom sturdily, you are he commonly called Old Scratch. The same at your service, replied the black man with a half-civil nod. All right, there's a lot to unpack there. I want to talk about symbolism a bit. This is on your exit ticket. So if you notice, the devil is in the forest, and all of the rich men, their names from the village, are all on trees. And what the devil does is he chops them down slowly. And when the tree comes down, that person is dead. And they get used as firewood for burning in a fireplace, which is a symbol for hell. So let me say this again. What happens is the men all have trees with their names on it in the forest. When the tree is chopped down, the man dies. Then the logs or timber is used in a fireplace, and that is to symbolize souls burning in hell. So that's your symbolism there, okay? And it's the rich people, and again, that's another archetype. Rich people are bad, okay? That's something that happens a lot in literature. If you look at the Disney movies, cartoons, anybody that's rich normally is a bad person. That is another archetype in literature. And so I wanted to go over that. I also wanted you to notice that the devil has a lot of names in this text. Old Scratch, Black Miner, Wild Huntsman, Black Woodsman. So I wanted you to know that the devil has a lot of names. We call this nomenclature. When you actually name, it's the naming of things. Nomenclature has to deal with the naming of things. For example, if you have what I call tennis or tennis shoes, you know, some people call them sneakers, athletic shoes, running shoes, that type of thing. We have a whole bunch of names for them. Just like if you have a sub, some people might call it a sandwich, a hoagie, a hero. You know, they're just nomenclature. It depends on where you are regionally, how things are named. All of that happens in that passage. The last thing I want to talk about is a little bit of racism in the text. The devil is dark. He's not a black man, but he's dark. Notice that he's wearing Indian, aka Native American, garb. And keep in mind that Washington Irving keeps calling them savages. And notice that he has the Indians worshiping the devil. That is the racism that existed against Native Americans that Washington Irving put into his fiction story. Okay? He didn't like the Native Americans and thought they were savages. So in his story, he has them called savages and he has them worshiping the devil. That's an example of racism, okay, in the text. All right. Such was the opening of this interview, according to the old story, though. It has almost too familiar an air to be credited. One would think that to meet with such a singular personage in this wild, lonely place would have shaken any man's nerves. But Tom was a hard-minded fellow, not easily daunted, and he had lived so long with a termagant wife that he did not even fear the devil. That's an example of humor. He's not afraid of the devil because his wife is so scary. You know, that's humor. It is said that after this commencement, they had a long and earnest conversation together. As Tom returned homeward, the black man told him of great sums of money buried by Kid the pirate under the oak trees on the high ridge, not far from the morass. All these were under his command and protected by his power, so that none could find them but such as propitiated his favor. These he offered to place within Tom Walker's reach, having conceived in a special kindness for him, but they were to be had only on certain conditions. What these conditions were may easily be surmised, though Tom never disclosed them publicly. They must have been very hard, for he required time to think of them, and he was not a man to stick at trifles where money was in view. When they had reached the edge of the swamp, the stranger paused. "What proof have I that all you have been telling me is true?" said Tom. "This is my signature," said the black man, pressing his finger on Tom's forehead. So saying, he turned off among the thickets of the swamp, and seemed, as Tom said, to go down, down, down into the earth until nothing but his head and shoulders could be seen, and so on, until he totally disappeared. So, at the end of the first 3 pages, the devil has promised him Kid the Pirate's treasure. Tom said, "I need to think about it." Your book doesn't say exactly, but we can assume, as your book says, it wants you to assume. The devil wants Tom's soul in return for these riches. And Tom said, "I'll think about it." I'm going to take a break now, and then we will pick up with section 2 of the story.